Clarke, continuing with our conversation, going in depth about the actual DWI stop. I know you've handled thousands of these cases, so here's the question. What are the most common reasons for a stop?
Boy, most often it's speeding. That's the one we see most often. People who've been drinking a little bit tend to be relaxed and tend to speed. So
you might not be weaving, but you might just be speeding.
Just simply speeding, but once they've got you pulled over legally, they can follow up on the investigation. So speeding's the most common, but we really want to look at two broad categories. And the first is when you've committed a true infraction of the law that the police officer's seen with his own eyes, making an illegal left turn, going the wrong way down a one-way street, speeding, driving at night without turning on your headlights. Those are the ones we see most often. And as long as you got an honest officer, those are going to be hard to fight. They've got a valid reason for detaining you. But it bleeds over into a gray area when you start talking about violations that aren't real clear-cut. Gee, you're weaving in your lane of travel. Well, that's not a violation of the law, but it may be a legal stop if the officer has reasonable and articulable suspicion. And that's where State versus Watkins is argued all the time. You look at the facts of that case and say the facts of our case match that, and therefore it's an illegal stop. So the ones that we see a lot that we can challenge, weaving in your lane of travel, a long delay at a green light. A light turns green and you're playing with your radio and don't look up for 7 or 10 seconds, well, the officer's going to pull you over. Well, is that a legal stop? You haven't done anything wrong, you were just slow leaving the green light. Well, that can be challenged in court. A wide turn. The officer says you made a wide turn into a double lane. That's not a violation of the law. It may be suspicion.
What about unusual situations? Because the things we've talked about so far are sort of common things anybody can do. Well, I've made a U-turn, I didn't mean to, whether it's a DWI issue or not. What about unusual situations?
Well, there are several different types of unusual situations that don't really fall into the driving area, and that would be checkpoints if you're stopped at a checkpoint, or if you've been involved in a wreck. And we'll go into those in much greater detail because a lot of those result in DWIs.
Thanks, Clarke. And we're going to continue this theme and talk more about DWI stops. Let's say, for instance, stopped at a checkpoint. That and much more in the next segment. Clarke, we're still talking about DWI stops, the stop itself. There are two things I want to ask you about. One is, what if you're stopped at a routine checkpoint? And the other is, what about drug checkpoints? Can you address both of those?
I certainly can, and I love your phrasing, routine checkpoint. There's no such thing as a routine checkpoint, but police use it every day in the courtroom. Routine doesn't mean a thing. A checkpoint's a checkpoint, and a checkpoint is an unconstitutional seizure. Now, there's a narrow exception. If the state jumps through all the right hoops, they can set up a DWI checking station. And that was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court back in 1989 in a case called Michigan versus Sitz. Now, in Michigan, they specifically set up a DWI checkpoint in which the people were detained for an average of 18 to 25 seconds. Minimal detention.
Everybody?
Everybody that drove down this one road.
Okay.
There was somebody answerable to the public out there, an elected official. They posted signs in advance, you're entering a DWI checkpoint.
That's fair.
And the U.S. Supreme Court, in a split decision, a 5-4 decision, so it could have gone either way, decided that the harm caused by the immediate vehicle-bound threat of a drunk driver was so great that they would allow this minimal intrusion. Now, the same doesn't apply to license checks. There's no immediate vehicle-bound threat of anybody if your license happens to be expired for 30 days or so.
Right.
And there's still the same amount of intrusion, if not greater intrusion, when you set up a license check, because then you're not restricted to 18 to 25 seconds of, have you got alcohol in your system? No, okay, you're free to go. Instead, they stop you and they walk around the car and they look for anything they can possibly find, and that is illegal. Now, I'm still fighting it. We're still waiting for the Court of Appeals to render a decision in Vesey, the case that I've taken up. So we're still waiting for an answer on that.
Right. Now, what about the other thing I mentioned, which was drug checkpoints?
Well, Checkpoints started with Michigan versus Sitz back in 1989, and that was up in Michigan, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, we're going to approve DWI checkpoints. Well, the police didn't hear the DWI part of it. They feel like we've approved checkpoints. So during the 90s, police began setting up random checkpoints where they would go through and walk drug dogs around your car. And finally, it made it up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, you cannot have drug checkpoints. There's no immediate vehicle-bound threat of a drug dealer. They are a threat to our community, but they're not a vehicle-bound threat. The mere fact that they use a vehicle to transport drugs doesn't make it a vehicle-bound threat. And so the U.S. Supreme Court has thrown out drug checkpoints. They've approved DWI checkpoints. They haven't spoken yet on license checks, but I think I'm going to win it.
Well, we hope so, and I appreciate that information, but there's something else I want to go into. We'll do in the next segment, and that is what happens on a DWI stop when a wreck is involved. Pretty complicated stuff, but we're going to make it simple to understand in the next segment.